June 4, 1945, Camp Mexia, Texas, United States of America. The Texas heat descended upon the barracks like a curtain of liquid bronze, and young Heinz Müller, 19 years old, Hitlerjugend, until 3 weeks ago, pressed his face against the wire fence while observing something that should not exist. Dodge trucks loaded to the brim, not with ammunition, with food. White bread stacked in boxes that seemed endless. He had been taught since age 12 that America was a decadent nation, corrupt, about to collapse under the weight of its own moral and industrial weakness, that its soldiers were cowards, its civilians disorganized, its economy a farce sustained by Jews and speculators. But there he stood, prisoner of war on enemy soil, and what he saw was not collapse. It was abundance. It was order. It was something so distant from the reality they had sold him that his mind refused to process it. An American sergeant, black in impeccable uniform, approached the fence with a tired smile and extended a Hershey's chocolate bar. Heinz accepted with trembling hands, and in that instant, between the silver wrapper and the sweet taste melting on his tongue, an entire universe of certainties began to crumble. Between May and June 1945, more than 380,000 German prisoners of war crossed the Atlantic in Liberty ships, packed in holds like human cargo, expecting the worst. Many were hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, men who had fought at Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy. Others were teenagers hastily recruited in the war's final months, with uniforms too large and ideas too small to contain the reality that awaited them. All carried the same invisible baggage: years of meticulously constructed indoctrination by the Reichsministerium für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda, the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Joseph Goebbels had been a brilliant architect of lies. For 12 years, the German people had been fed a carefully calibrated narrative. America was a hollow giant, a fragile democracy dominated by Chicago gangsters and Jewish Hollywood magnates, a mongrel and degenerate society that produced jazz and vulgar films but was incapable of producing real tanks. American soldiers, German newsreels claimed, were weak, undisciplined, without spirit of sacrifice. Lend-Lease was exaggerated by Allied propaganda. American industrial production, a statistical illusion. Geography itself protected Germany. The Atlantic was vast, logistics impossible, and the Americans would never project real power across an ocean. But then came 1944, and Normandy, and Operation Overlord. 156,000 men landing in a single day, supported by a fleet that darkened the horizon. And then, more. 500,000, 1 million, 2 million American soldiers flowing through Western Europe like an unstoppable tide. Sherman tanks by the thousands. Trucks, jeeps, supplies, fuel, ammunition in volumes that defied comprehension. German soldiers began to realize in the war's final months that something was terribly wrong with the narrative they had received. But it was only when they crossed the Atlantic as prisoners, when they stepped on American soil and saw with their own eyes, that truth exploded in their faces like a grenade of cognitive shock. The camps were not what Berlin had promised. There were no firing squads waiting at the docks, no starvation pens, no systematic brutality. Instead, there was paperwork, registration, medical examination, transportation to internment facilities that looked more like military bases than concentration camps, and food. So much food that some prisoners, accustomed to Wehrmacht rations of the final year, became physically ill from eating too quickly, their shrunken stomachs unable to process abundance. The prisoner of war camps in the United States were not the promised hell. They were something else, something young Germans had no vocabulary to describe because they had never experienced it. Camp Mexia, Texas, Camp Aliceville, Alabama, Camp Ruston, Louisiana, Camp Stark, New Hampshire, hundreds of them scattered across 46 states, housing more than 400,000 Germans. And all shared the same disconcerting characteristic. They functioned. Heinz Müller, in his first 48 hours on Texas soil, mentally registered a series of observations that made no sense within his previous worldview. First observation: the guards did not beat, nor did they shout unnecessarily. They treated prisoners with a professional indifference that bordered on boredom, not with hatred, not with contempt, just with the efficiency of men following orders in a nation that needed to prove nothing through cruelty. Second observation: the food. It was not merely abundant, it was varied. Coffee in the morning, not that mixture of roasted barley and chicory that had sustained Germany in recent years. Real coffee, white bread, eggs, bacon when available. Rations followed U.S. Army standards, which meant German prisoners ate better in captivity than freed German soldiers ate in the field. Third observation, and perhaps most disturbing, Americans did not seem to be at war, not in the sense Heinz knew. There were no ruined cities visible from the camp, no starving crowds, no apparent fuel rationing or infrastructure collapse. The trucks passing on the nearby road were new, shiny, countless. The clothes of civilians they occasionally glimpsed were clean, well cut without patches. And even more disconcerting, many civilians were black, those Untermenschen about whom Goebbels spoke so much, and they drove cars, wore suits, moved with the confidence of citizens in a functional society. The cognitive dissonance was physical. Heinz felt it in his stomach, a nausea that came not from food, but from the impossibility of reconciling what he saw with what he had believed for 7 years. He was not alone. In the barracks at night, prisoners conversed in embarrassed whispers, sharing observations none dared transform into explicit conclusions. Not yet. Truth needed to be absorbed slowly, like poison or medicine, depending on perspective. The chocolate bar had been just the beginning. What came next would be the systematic demolition of everything they thought they knew about power, freedom, and the nature of industrial civilization itself. The first major turning point came when prisoners received permission to work. Not slave labor, not death camps, paid work, governed by Geneva Conventions, 80 cents per day in canteen credit. Farms needed labor, canneries, sawmills, cotton harvests in the Deep South. Germans left the camps under minimal supervision, worked alongside American civilians, and at day's end, returned. Some did not return. They escaped. But not to flee. They escaped to local bars to dance with Texas girls, to drink American beer that, though weaker than German, was abundant. It was during these work shifts that Heinz first saw the interior of a typical American farm. Not an aristocrat's estate, just a family of white farmers, Methodists, with a son serving in the Navy somewhere in the Pacific. The wife, a woman in her early 40s with calloused hands and gentle smile, offered him iced lemonade during break. Lemonade, with ice, in the middle of war. Heinz accepted the glass, sat in the shade of an oak tree and looked around. A brand new John Deere tractor, gleaming in the sun, well-maintained barns, a Ford pickup parked near the house, a radio antenna on the roof. He thought of his own family in Würzburg. He thought of the house destroyed by Allied bombing in February 1945. He thought of his mother standing in endless lines for rotten potatoes and black bread made with sawdust. He thought of his father, killed at Kursk in 1943, and how the Reich's official letter described his death as heroic sacrifice for Führer and fatherland. And he thought, for the first time allowed himself to think, whether all that sacrifice had been for something real, or just for empty words spoken by men who had lied from the beginning. At night, in the barracks, one of the older veterans, a Feldwebel aged 43 named Ernst, broke the collective silence. "You know what haunts me?" he said, voice low, loaded with something between rage and admiration. "It's not that they're strong, it's that they never needed to try hard. This is their strength at rest. And we gave everything we had. And it wasn't enough. It never was." The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield that existed only in their minds. The battlefield where ideology confronted material reality and lost. Psychological reactions varied like spectrums on an invisible battlefield. Some prisoners retreated into denial, constructing elaborate theories. This was propaganda too, an elaborate American deception, temporary abundance that would collapse any day. Others fell into depression, the weight of recognition crushing. If everything they had been told about America was false, what else was false? The racial theories? The Lebensraum justification? The entire moral architecture of the Reich? Werner Koch, 22, former Panzer Grenadier, experienced something close to religious conversion. He had been at Falaise, had seen the endless American fighter bombers turning German columns into burning wreckage. He had attributed it to temporary advantage, to luck, to anything except systematic superiority. But in Texas, working at a cotton gin, he watched the machinery. American machinery. Mass-produced interchangeable parts, maintained by semi-skilled workers who learned from standardized manuals. He asked questions. The foreman, a man missing 2 fingers from a childhood farm accident, explained the concept of assembly line production, of Taylorism, of industrial processes designed for maximum efficiency with minimum skill requirement. "We don't need masters," the foreman said, not unkindly. "We need systems. Good systems work even with average people. That's the secret, son. Not supermen, just good systems." Werner lay awake that night, staring at the barracks ceiling. The Reich had promised a new order built on the superiority of the Aryan race, on the triumph of will over matter, on the genius of exceptional individuals. But what if the real future belonged not to supermen but to systems? What if mass production was more powerful than mass rallies? What if the boring, unglamorous work of logistics and supply chains and standardized components was the actual engine of victory? The psychological impact manifested physically. Some prisoners gained weight rapidly, their bodies responding to adequate nutrition for the first time in years. Others developed nervous tics, struggled with sleep. The camp doctors, American doctors who treated enemy prisoners with the same protocols as American soldiers, documented cases of what they clinically termed ideological disorientation syndrome. In the barracks, men who had once sung Horst Wessel Lied with conviction now sat silent during evening hours, smoking American cigarettes, trying to rebuild worldviews from shattered foundations. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Friedrich, began keeping a secret journal. His first entry, dated June 18, 1945, read simply, "We were taught to despise them. We should have been taught to learn from them. That was our real defeat. Not Normandy, not Berlin, but the lies that made learning impossible." The subplot that emerged was unexpected. Education. The U.S. War Department, in consultation with psychological warfare experts, implemented a re-education program. Not brutal indoctrination, American-style persuasion, which relied less on force and more on exposure. Camp libraries received newspapers, magazines, books. Prisoners could read uncensored accounts of the war, of the Holocaust, of the Reich's collapse. Documentary films were shown, footage from liberated concentration camps, carefully filmed evidence that many prisoners initially rejected as Allied propaganda. Heinz attended one such screening in July 1945. The film showed Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers bulldozing mountains of corpses, skeletal survivors staring at cameras with eyes that had seen hell. The narrator's voice was clinical, almost gentle, stating facts, dates, locations, estimated death tolls. No melodrama, no accusation, just documentation. The barracks erupted after the screening. Half the prisoners claimed it was fake, staged with actors and makeup. The other half sat in stunned silence. Ernst, the Feldwebel, stood and said something that changed the tenor of discussion. "I was at the Eastern Front. I saw things. We all saw things. We told ourselves it was necessary. War is hell, we said. But this," he gestured at the now blank screen, "this was industry. This was system. They built factories for death, the same way Americans built factories for trucks. And we knew. Some part of us always knew." The camp split into factions. The unrepentant who clung to Nazi ideology despite everything, the quietly skeptical who began questioning but remained uncommitted, and the converted who experienced what one American observer described as the psychological equivalent of watching your God die in real time. Intelligence officers conducted interviews, compiled reports. They discovered patterns. Younger prisoners, especially those with limited direct combat experience, converted more readily. Veterans were harder to crack, their identities too deeply fused with the regime they had served. But even among veterans, cracks appeared. They compared notes about the war, the endless retreats, the ammunition shortages, the promises of wonder weapons that never came, the Führer's increasingly delusional orders. When you removed the propaganda filter, the pattern was clear. They had fought bravely for a regime that squandered their courage on delusions. By August, Camp Mexia's educational program was considered a model. Prisoners voluntarily attended lectures on democracy, on constitutional government, on the principles of free market economics, not because they were forced, because they were curious, because they had seen enough to know their previous answers were wrong and desperately needed new ones. The emotional weight increased when letters from home began arriving. The mail, censored but functional, brought news from the wasteland. Heinz received his first letter in September 1945. His mother's handwriting trembled across the page. Their home was gone. She lived with relatives in a basement. Food was scarce. The occupation forces were establishing order, but Germany itself was being divided, carved up by victors. She asked if he was well fed, if he was safe. She did not ask if he still believed. The contrast was unbearable. Heinz sat in a Texas camp gaining weight, working for wages, eating 3 meals daily, sleeping in heated barracks while his mother scavenged in rubble. The guilt was physical, a weight in his chest. But mixed with guilt was something else. Recognition of who bore responsibility. Not the Americans who had defeated Germany, not the British who had bombed Würzburg, but the men who had started the war, who had promised victory, who had sacrificed an entire generation for their delusions of grandeur. Other prisoners received darker news. Wives dead in bombing raids, children orphaned, entire towns erased. The lucky ones received letters. Many received only silence, the worst news of all. And through it all, the cognitive dissonance deepened. They, the defeated enemies, ate better than their victorious captors' own civilians had eaten during the Depression. America's abundance was so vast it could feed both its people and its enemies simultaneously. A moral crisis emerged, articulated best by Werner during a late-night discussion. "We have a duty to suffer," he said. "We started this. We followed them. We didn't ask enough questions. And now we sit here comfortable while our families starve in our ruins. How do we reconcile this? How do we accept their mercy when we showed none?" An American chaplain invited to speak at the camp offered an answer that confused more than it clarified. "Grace," he said, "is not about deserving. That's the point. You don't deserve this treatment. Neither did your victims deserve what happened to them. The question isn't about balancing scales. It's about choosing what kind of men you'll be going forward. You can't undo the past, but you can refuse to repeat it." The words resonated differently with each listener. Some rejected it as Christian weakness. Others absorbed it like water in drought. Heinz copied the chaplain's words in his own letter home. "Mother, I am learning that strength and mercy are not opposites. I am learning that we were taught to confuse brutality with courage. I am learning, but the lessons are hard. The escalation came not through confrontation, but through revelation." By late 1945, the full scope of American industrial capacity became impossible to deny. Prisoners working in civilian industries saw it firsthand. Factories that had produced Liberty ships, one every 42 days at peak production. Assembly lines that had manufactured a bomber every 63 minutes. The statistics were nauseating in their implications. America had produced more military equipment in 4 years than Germany had in 12. While simultaneously raising civilian living standards. Werner, assigned to work at a Ford plant in Michigan after transfer, stood on the factory floor and felt something close to religious awe. The assembly line moved with mechanical precision. Workers, many of them women, many black, many immigrants, performed specialized tasks with efficiency born not from superior genetics, but from superior organization. The plant manager, a tired man with an engineering degree from Michigan State, explained the philosophy during a lunch break Werner would never forget. "War is math," the manager said, unwrapping a sandwich. "You Germans thought it was about will, about spirit, about the Übermensch. But it's math. How many tons of steel? How many man-hours? How many units per day? We didn't win because we were braver. We won because we could outproduce you 10 to 1, and we built systems that let regular people do extraordinary things. That's democracy, kid. Not speeches about blood and soil, just good systems and people free enough to make them work." The prisoners began sharing technical manuals, smuggled or legitimately acquired. They studied American engineering journals, marveled at the banality of excellence. There were no Teutonic supermen in these factories, just shift workers following procedures, managers solving logistical puzzles, engineers iterating on designs. The genius was distributed, systemic, unromantic. Everything the Reich had mocked about democracy, its messy compromises, its pedestrian focus on practical results over ideological purity, turned out to be its strength. Political changes accelerated the transformation. News reached the camps. The Nuremberg trials had begun. Former leaders who had promised victory now sat in defendants' docks, their pretensions stripped away, reduced to ordinary criminals facing ordinary justice. The mystique shattered completely. These were not titans of a new age. They were merely men who had lied exceptionally well, and millions had died believing them. By winter 1945, Camp Mexia had evolved into something unprecedented, a community of former believers wrestling with apostasy. They had not merely lost a war, they had lost a worldview, and in its place, slowly, painfully, something else was growing. Not necessarily faith in democracy, but at least recognition that the alternative had failed catastrophically. Convergence came through unexpected alliances. Jewish American officers, some refugees themselves, interacted with German prisoners in ways that defied simple narratives. Captain David Goldstein, born in Berlin, fled to New York in 1936, now returned to process the men who might have killed him had history tilted differently. He spoke to prisoners in flawless German, explaining American history, the immigrant experience, the idea that nationality was choice, not destiny. "You were taught that we're weak because we're diverse," Goldstein said during one educational session, that our mongrel society would crumble under pressure. But look what happened. We absorbed refugees, gave them opportunity, and they built atomic bombs, designed aircraft, cracked codes. Your best scientist fled to us. Your loss was our gain. That's not weakness. That's the advantage of freedom. Some prisoners spat at his feet. Others listened with the intensity of drowning men spotting land. Heinz was among the latter. He asked questions. How did American Jews prosper when Nazi theory insisted they were parasites? How did black soldiers fight bravely when racial science deemed them inferior? How did women run factories when they were supposedly intellectually inferior to men? The answers were frustratingly simple. Talent was talent, regardless of origin. Systems that utilized all available human capital outperformed systems that arbitrarily excluded most of it. This was not moral philosophy. It was efficiency mathematics. Germany had persecuted Einstein and got nuclear physics research that lagged years behind. America had welcomed Einstein and got atomic bombs. Secret revelations also emerged. Some prisoners, former intelligence officers, had already known about the Holocaust's extent. They had participated, or witnessed, or willfully ignored. Their psychological burden was different. Not discovery of lies, but confession of truths. A former SS officer, whose name remains classified in U.S. archives, collaborated with Allied investigators, providing detailed testimony about extermination operations. His motivation, recorded in interview transcripts: "I want it documented. I want future Germans to know it was real, so they can never pretend, as I tried to pretend, that we didn't know." The convergence of testimony, evidence, and lived experience in American camps created a critical mass of understanding. By early 1946, the majority of prisoners, excepting the hardcore ideologues, had reached a painful consensus. They had fought for a regime built on lies, sustained by violence, and doomed from the start. The chocolate bar had been the first crack. Everything after was the flood. Prisoner exchanges began. Some POWs returned to Germany. Others applied for immigration status, hoping to remain in America. The split was telling. Those who saw opportunity versus those who saw only defeat. Preparation for repatriation brought both relief and dread. Starting in 1946, prisoners began the journey home, back to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they remembered. They would return as witnesses to two worlds: the Reich, that had promised them heaven and delivered hell, and America, that had promised them nothing and delivered a lesson in civilizational power they would never forget. Heinz spent his final weeks in Camp Mexia preparing. He had saved his canteen earnings, bought English language books, copied addresses of American families who had shown him kindness. He wrote letters he would never send, practicing arguments he would have with countrymen who had not seen what he had seen. How do you explain abundance to people who know only scarcity? How do you describe a society that treats its enemies better than your society treated its own citizens? The camp held a final assembly. The American commander, a colonel who had fought across France, addressed the prisoners with honesty that bordered on brutality. "You're going home to a broken country. Much of that breaking was necessary. Your regime needed to be destroyed. But destruction isn't the end. Germany will be rebuilt. The question is what kind of Germany you'll help build. Will you rebuild the lies? Or will you build something honest? That choice is yours." Tensions ran high. Unrepentant Nazis, perhaps 15% of the camp population, muttered about betrayal, about propaganda, about Americans buying souls with chocolate. The majority remained silent, processing, calculating. Werner stood and spoke, his voice carrying across the assembly yard. "I came here hating you. I leave here respecting you. Not because you defeated us. That's just war. But because you showed us a better way, and we were too blind to see it until we had no choice. Some will call us traitors for admitting this. I call us survivors. We survived the lies. That's its own kind of victory." The speech divided opinion cleanly. Half the prisoners applauded, half glared in silence. The American officers took notes, updating their psychological assessments, determining who would be safe to release and who needed additional observation. The criteria were simple: not whether prisoners loved America, but whether they had abandoned the ideology that started the war. Re-education was not about conversion to democracy. It was about vaccination against fascism. And like all vaccines, it worked better on some than others. The confrontation came not on a battlefield, but in 1,000 small moments of choice. As prisoners boarded ships for return voyages, they faced immediate tests. Would they report what they had seen honestly, or conform to whatever narrative awaited in occupied Germany? Would they maintain friendships with Americans who had shown them kindness, or disavow them under social pressure? Would they raise their children with new truths, or retreat into comfortable old lies? Heinz Müller's ship departed from New York Harbor in March 1946. He stood on deck watching the Statue of Liberty recede and felt an emotion he couldn't name. Not love for America. He had lost too much to love his conquerors. But respect, deep and undeniable. And more than that, hope. If a nation this powerful could also be this merciful, perhaps mercy was not weakness. Perhaps the future belonged not to those who could endure the most suffering, but to those who could create the most prosperity. The ship carried 700 former prisoners. In the holds, debates raged. Some prisoners had converted completely, speaking of American democracy with the zeal of new believers. Others remained bitter, attributing their treatment to propaganda rather than policy. Most occupied the middle ground, acknowledging what they had seen while remaining unsure what it meant. They played cards, shared rations that were still better than what awaited in Germany, and argued philosophy with the intensity of men who had watched their certainties die. Ernst, the old Feldwebel, organized a final discussion group. His question was simple: what do we tell them when they ask what America was like? The answers varied wildly. Some said, tell them it was propaganda, all of it. Others said, tell them everything, let them decide. Werner said, tell them the truth, we lost to a nation that didn't even bother to hate us. That should terrify anyone who thinks war is about courage rather than capacity. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, prisoners looked toward Europe with mixed feelings: relief to return home, dread at what home had become, and a strange, unexpected gratitude, not for being defeated, but for being shown a truth they would have never accepted if they had simply been told. Sometimes the only teacher powerful enough to shatter dogma is reality itself, delivered with overwhelming, undeniable force. They had received that education. Now came the test. Would they apply what they learned? The apex of transformation came not during captivity, but after return. Germany in 1946 was apocalypse made real. 16 million displaced persons, cities reduced to rubble, economy collapsed, population starving, divided into occupation zones, the entire national project revealed as catastrophic failure. Into this wasteland returned 400,000 former prisoners from American camps, carrying memories of abundance that seemed like hallucinations. Heinz returned to Würzburg to find his mother living in a basement with 12 other people, subsisting on rations barely sufficient to prevent starvation. The contrast with Texas was so extreme it felt obscene. He gave her his saved canteen earnings, US dollars that could buy more on the black market than Reichsmarks ever could. He told her what he had seen. She listened with the hollow expression of someone beyond surprise. "Did they really treat you well?" she asked. "Better than we treated ourselves," he replied. The verdict of reality was harsh but clear. Prisoners who had been in American camps were physically healthier, psychologically more resilient, and economically better positioned than Germans who had remained free. Some returnees faced accusations of collaboration. Others found their accounts dismissed as American propaganda. But slowly, inexorably, the truth spread through the rubble. The regime had lied about everything, about its strength, about its enemies, about the nature of power itself. Werner found work with American occupation authorities, translating and facilitating reconstruction. He used his Camp Mexia experience to explain American methods to skeptical Germans. "They don't rule through fear," he explained. "They rule through competence. Learn from that." The transformation was not universal. Thousands of former POWs retreated into bitter silence, nursing grievances, maintaining Nazi beliefs in secret or semi-secret. But many, perhaps most, underwent genuine change. They had seen the alternative. They had touched the machinery of a functional civilization. They had eaten the chocolate, drunk the coffee, lived the experience of a society that worked. That memory could not be erased by ideology or propaganda or wishful thinking. By 1948, as the Marshall Plan began rebuilding Western Europe, some former prisoners recognized the pattern. America was doing for its former enemies what it had done for its prisoners, feeding them, rebuilding their infrastructure, teaching them systems that worked. It was the same philosophy writ large, that prosperity was more powerful than punishment, that generosity was a strategic asset, that the best way to prevent future wars was to give former enemies a stake in peace. The education had been expensive. Millions of lives, entire cities, a civilization's worth of destruction. But for those who survived and learned, the lesson was permanent. The true climax was not military but moral. The moment when enough former prisoners accepted that their entire worldview had been constructed on foundations of sand. This happened not all at once but in cascading waves throughout 1946 and 1947, as returnees compared their experiences with the reality of occupied Germany. The realization was devastating and liberating simultaneously. Heinz experienced his personal climax in autumn 1946, standing in the ruins of Würzburg's old town. He held a letter from an American family he had worked for in Texas, the farming family that had given him lemonade. They wrote to ask if he was safe, if he needed anything, if they could send care packages. They signed it, "With Christian Love," and included photographs of their son, the sailor, returned safely from the Pacific. Heinz wept, not from sadness but from the collision of realities. Enemies who cared more for his welfare than his own government ever had. The ideological collapse was complete. Everything the Reich had taught about racial hierarchies, about the weakness of democracy, about the necessity of totalitarian strength, had been systematically disproven by lived experience. The strongest nation was the most diverse. The most effective military was the least ideological. The most prosperous economy was the least controlled. Every Nazi principle, when tested against material reality, had failed, but understanding this created new burdens. Former prisoners who had fully absorbed the lesson faced a choice: rebuild Germany in America's image, or rebuild it as something uniquely German but informed by American principles. This tension would define West German development for decades. The recognition that democracy and capitalism worked, combined with the determination to implement them in ways that reflected European rather than American values. The psychological impact was permanent. Men who had stood in Camp Mexia and accepted chocolate from black sergeants could never again fully believe in racial supremacy. Men who had seen American factories could never again dismiss democracy as weakness. Men who had eaten American rations while their countrymen starved could never again trust authoritarian promises of strength through sacrifice. They became, in effect, a secret society of the enlightened, former believers who had seen behind the curtain and could never unsee. Some remained silent, their knowledge private. Others became evangelists of the new wisdom, arguing that Germany's only path forward was to learn from its conquerors. Both groups carried the same scar, the knowledge that they had fought, suffered, and sacrificed for lies. That knowledge, bitter but true, was the beginning of wisdom. Decades later, historians would analyze the German POW experience in America as an unintended but highly successful component of denazification. The prisoners had not been tortured into compliance or indoctrinated through force. They had simply been shown an alternative reality and allowed to draw their own conclusions. Many drew the right ones. Heinz Müller lived until 2003. He became a teacher, specializing in history and civics. He never spoke much about the war, but when he did, he always returned to the same image: a black sergeant in Texas heat, extending a hand through a wire fence, offering chocolate to a 19-year-old who had been taught to hate him. That moment, Heinz would say, contained everything important: the difference between ideology and humanity, between propaganda and truth, between the world as we're told it is and the world as it actually is. Werner Koch emigrated to the United States in 1952, became a citizen in 1957, worked as an industrial engineer in Detroit. He raised 3 children who knew their father had fought for the wrong side and learned from it. His greatest pride, he often said, was not that America had defeated Germany, but that America had shown Germany how to be defeated honorably, a gift more valuable than victory. Ernst, the old Feldwebel, died in 1951, never fully reconciled to Germany's defeat, but honest enough to admit the Reich had deserved it. His last words, recorded by a hospital chaplain, were, "We were brave, but bravery in service of lies is just expensive stupidity. I wish we had been wiser. I wish we had been humble enough to learn before we had to be taught by force." The chocolate became symbol and symptom, a small gesture that represented a civilizational gulf. Germany had promised its people glory through conquest. America had given its enemies candy because it could, because it had enough for everyone, because mercy was a luxury it could afford. That abundance, that casual generosity, that systemic competence, these were the true weapons that won the war. The bombs and tanks were merely their instruments. For the young Germans who experienced American captivity, the lesson was eternal. Power without wisdom is tyranny, and wisdom without power is useless. America had demonstrated both. Germany had possessed neither. The difference was measured not in battlefield victories but in chocolate bars extended through wire fences, small mercies that revealed vast truths about the nature of strength, justice, and what it means to build a civilization worth defending.